When I was thinking about doing a part 2 to the Field Guide to Wonderland, our conference last year, I thought, well, what would be a really good informational cornerstone talk to start with? And then I saw this essay, Fungi, Folklore, and Fairy Tales, and it was a done deal. So I asked Mike Jay, who is a cultural historian and author, to be on and tell us all about mushrooms going from Victorian times. Pretty much we cover everything, like up to the psychedelic 60s, and it's just taken me a second here to queue up the video. Mike Jay, welcome. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Oh, it's a real pleasure to join you, Heather.
And I know everyone is very excited about this topic, magic mushrooms in Wonderland. And I was very intrigued by your article, Fungi, Folklore, and Fairyland, because you asked some very interesting questions. I know Carrollians as a whole definitely do not think for a moment that Lewis Carroll ever took any sort of psychedelic drugs that influenced his writing, but your questions that you asked were very intriguing. Is it possible that the Victorian fairy tradition, beneath its innocent exterior, operated as a conduit for a hidden tradition of psychedelic knowledge? Were the authors of these fantastical narratives, Alice in Wonderland, for example, aware of the power of certain mushrooms to lead unsuspecting visitors to enchanted lands? And were they perhaps even writing from personal experience? So we're going to get into all of that, but I was hoping at first that maybe you could give us a little background into how mushrooms were used in Victorian literature in general.
I guess by the time you get to the Victorian era, there are really two traditions of, or two kind of types of, tropes associated with mushrooms and fungi and toadstools. And the first is the one that emerges from medieval and Renaissance herbals and materia medicas and from the culture more broadly. And that's the idea that fungi are unwholesome and associated with rot and decay and death and disease. And that's the association that you find early in the 19th century in the Romantic poets, Shelley and Keats. I think leprous like a corpse's cheek. I think that's Keats, and where you find mushrooms and fungi, they're usually kind of growing on carrion or they're sort of rotting something down. So there's that association, and I think that ties into a generalized suspicion of mushrooms in Northern European cultures. They're always suspected to be poisonous. People know that there are poisonous ones out there. They're not really an item in sort of normal cuisine, for example. But then what starts to emerge as the 19th century progresses is a separate tradition of the association of fungi and mushrooms and toadstools with fairyland. And that obviously has ancient roots. I mean, like most fairy lore, it goes back to Shakespeare. It's Midsummer Night's Dream, but also there are references to fairy rings in Merry Wives of Windsor, I think. And gradually, as the people get more interested in folklore, I think it's a kind of effect of the Industrial Revolution in a way. People get more interested in sort of in the natural world and traditional lifestyles, and fungi become an important sort of signifier of that. So fairy rings, but also toadstools and the little imaginary sprites and elves and gnomes that live in woodland tend to shelter under mushrooms and so on. And you get the associations of, as you do with the flower fairies and so on. They become emblematic of the spirit of the forest and the wild countryside, and that becomes very quite sentimental and very formalized. I guess the survival of that, the vestige of that in modern culture, is the garden gnome. I don't know if they're so familiar with you, but certainly if you go to a garden centre in Britain, you'll be able to buy some fiberglass or plaster gnome that you can put on your suburban front lawn, and they'll almost always have a fly agaric sort of red and white spotted mushroom as part of their assemblage.
Glad you mentioned the fly agaric, and not only because I wasn't sure how to pronounce it, so that's perfect. I've heard it about 4 different ways. So that is, as you mentioned, that red spotted mushroom that like pretty much, if you think of mushroom, that's what comes to your mind, right? It's our emoji on our phone, it's in video games, it's just
Yeah.
absolutely everywhere. I was wondering if you could just, I know a lot of people have heard the term fairy rings, but for people who don't know exactly what those are about, what exactly is a fairy ring and how are they used in literature?
A fairy ring is some species of mushrooms. They spore, in a very neat circle. So you'll have like a mushroom that will sort of send out a nice circle of spores, and then usually the mushroom in the center will die because they only live a day or two. And so then you'll wake up one morning and there'll be this perfect circle of mushrooms or toadstools on the lawn or in the forest or in your woodland walk. And it's that, going back to Shakespeare, but also endlessly amplified in the sort of Victorian literature, is the idea that these are created for fairies, or that fairies use them to dance around, and they dance in circles, or maybe by dancing in circles they create these rings.
Excellent, thank you. So we've talked about sort of the magical, exciting, sentimental mushrooms, and we've talked about the death and decay mushrooms. What ideas about intoxicating mushrooms were inherited from the classical and medieval eras, like specifically intoxicating, dare we say, psychedelic type?
Yes, I think they're really not, and even in Lewis Carroll's day, they're really not, there's not a clear separate, I mean, the word intoxicating kind of spans both senses. It means kind of toxic, but also mind altering. And I think the idea that these mushrooms were mind altering was really folded into the idea of them being toxic. That this was a kind of a symptom of poisoning. So people weren't taking them kind of for fun, or as we would say today, recreationally, or as an interesting sort of adventure or spiritual journey. There are a few very telling, very interesting accounts of accidental intoxication with mushrooms. There's a very good one from 1799. And what you see there is that when people eat that make a soup out of the mushrooms that they've gathered, occasionally there would be some in there that would make people feel very odd and peculiar, and people would start to notice, a bit nausea and weird feelings in the stomach, and then a bit of delirium and starting to lose track of their thoughts, and time and space getting a bit confused. And that would be taken as, usually as, oh my God, I've eaten some, poisonous mushrooms, I'm going to die. So the sequel to that, and this goes right on up into the 20th century. So the sequel to that, what would in modern times be regarded as the trip, would be spent having enemas or going to hospital and having your stomach pumped. So the idea of the altered states and hallucinations that they produced were seen as part of the toxicity, in the same way that if you had a very high fever or a delirium or a psychotic episode, you might have these kind of effects. So the idea that these effects are pleasant or desirable doesn't really exist until you start to get travelers' tales in the 18th century from Siberia, where people are Russian explorers, mostly Russian and Polish explorers, are saying they've come back and they've seen in these places that people eat fly agaric mushrooms for pleasure, and they have quite sort of rowdy gatherings where everybody gets together and eats fly agaric mushrooms. And there are, fly agaric mushrooms are well known in Europe and in Britain. They're called fly agaric because they're supposed to be poisonous. Though, in medieval times, you'd crumble them into some milk and put it on your windowsill to kill flies. So this is kind of news from Siberia, the idea that they're not just poisonous, but there is a kind of intoxication there that some, obviously primitive, savage people in, that part of the world pursue. And there are two details that are that are irresistible to pass on about this. One of them is the fact that when people eat the fly agaric mushrooms, then the toxins are filtered out in their kidneys, and the urine that they produced is also intoxicating. So, you know, it has been observed, you know, sort of second or third hand by Russian explorers that these people not only eat fly agaric mushrooms, but then after they've eaten them, then they urinate them, and urinate and pass the urine on to other people. So this is, of course, a sort of you know, irresistible detail. So that's always there, and when it gets when the details get handed on. The other detail is one, you know, which we'll recognise, which is really the one that encapsulates, you know, the hallucinogenic effects of fly agaric mushrooms, and that's the idea that people under the influence of them have strange hallucinations of kind of distorted size and shape, and things that are far off appear to be nearby, and the opposite, and things that are big look small, and things that are small look big. And the example that's always produced of this is somebody under the influence of fly agaric mushrooms seeing a straw in the middle of the road, and then thinking that to get over it they have to kind of make this huge exaggerated leap as if it's the size of a giant kind of fallen oak in the road. So that that detail comes from a Russian account from 1809, I think, and then by the mid-Victorian era, that's in every account of fly agaric. There's a very widely read book called Chemistry of Common Life by James Johnson, published in 1955, which is a very good, actually still very readable digest of, you know, the chemistry in the food that we eat and everything. And there's a sort of and there's a chapter about the chemistry of our intoxicants, and it passes on that detail. And quite possibly from there, it's picked up by Mordecai Cook, who was a writer who was very interested in intoxication, and wrote a book in 1860 called Seven Sisters of Sleep, which is a kind of survey, a big global survey of all the intoxicants known to mankind, a lot about alcohol in its different forms, and then also hashish and chewing coca leaves and betel nut and so on. And it's got a chapter at the end about fly agaric, and it picks up that detail and passes it on.
So much going on there. That urine tidbit is very fascinating. I mean, that's just economical. That's 2 trips for the price of 1 right there. Don't want to waste that. And I was wondering about what time did the rest of the world become aware that the shamans were doing this in Siberia? It
starts in the 18th century, are the first travelers' accounts, and sort of in the 1830s. There's a Polish, very good Polish account by someone called Joseph Kopecz. And he's unusual because previously it's mostly Russian observers talking about witnessing it, or maybe a couple of Russian soldiers taking it, and Kopecz takes it himself, and he's very sick, and he's in Kamchatka, you know, in the far east of Siberia, and he's given a mushroom, and it heals him, gives him a miraculous cure, and then takes him off to this fantasy land where he sees all kinds of extraordinary things, goes on this great cosmic adventure, and comes back and starts predicting the future with you know, amazing confidence, and impresses everybody.
Excellent. So he enjoyed the trip ultimately. Took him a while, but
he enjoyed it very much. So I think from him we get the idea that this might actually be something, you know, worth doing.
I love the account that I think it starts your essay, Fungi, Folklore, and Fairyland, about the poor family, the guy who made some soup for some broth for his family in 1799, and they all get horrifically sick. But I did enjoy, you know, they were all terrified and freaking out, but was it the son, the little boy, just kept giggling?
Yes, there's an 8-year-old boy, and there's yeah, it's, I mean, what's interesting about that is that there's a doctor, actually quite a distinguished doctor, you know, sort of physician of the royal household, happens to be passing by, and witnesses it, and of course gives them all enemas, and they recover, as we now know they would have recovered anyway. But that tells us quite a lot. I mean, it tells us that you know, what we call the, you know, now called magic mushrooms in Britain, the liberty caps, the little sort of pixie headed ones, obviously did exist, and people had a generalized sense that there were sort of poisonous mushrooms out there, but they didn't know exactly which species. and also that it was rare enough that a doctor who witnessed it would, write it up in a journal, which he did. And then fortunately there was a great artist, actually botanical artist called James Sowerby, was doing a illustrated book on the fungi of the British Isles, and he got wind of this story, and there's a little plate there of the mushrooms responsible. And if you look at them, there's a little like the ones behind you. It's actually a lot of different species. Some of them are what we'd now call liberty caps, and others aren't at all. So that's one thing about mushrooms that runs all the way through the 19th century, in fact. Is that people don't really know what species is the poisonous one, and people certainly don't know what's the chemical in it that's doing it, because the 19th century was the great century of sort of getting new substances from plants and alkaloids and so on. The first was morphine, which was isolated from the opium poppy in the 1804, 1805, and then by Lewis Carroll's time, caffeine had been extracted from coffee, nicotine, cocaine in 1860 from the coca leaf. So lots of plants were giving up their chemical secrets and being turned into nice kind of modern white powders that would sort of sit on a shelf and be used in research by scientists. But the mushrooms had never done that. Nobody knew what exactly it was in the mushrooms that did this.
So we know Lewis Carroll is a very unique individual, of course, but during his lifetime, or perhaps right around the time when he's writing and publishing Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, what would someone of his educational background and social class might know about mushrooms? Like, would he have read any of these accounts of the slight psychedelic trips, like that one in 1799? Would he be aware that that was a thing?
Yeah, I mean, he'd be aware more than most, I think. I think most educated people, the first thing that would be, that they want to say is, well, mushrooms are poisonous, they're very dangerous, don't eat them. That was the kind of, that was the main accepted knowledge. But for people who were curious, there was a bit more to learn. He had James Johnson's Chemistry of Common Life in his library, so he would have read that. It's very likely he read Mordecai Cook's Seven Sisters of Sleep, which reproduces the same kind of account, and in that he also mentions this intoxication from 1799 and says it's extraordinary that here we are 2 generations later and we have no idea what the chemical is on this, or even which mushroom it was. So I think I think that's what I think he would have known, that there were chemicals in mushrooms and fungi, we didn't know what they were, that were toxic, but also some of them had those strange hallucinatory effects.
And as we know, he was definitely interested in altered states of consciousness, right? Like, he was an early member of the Society of Psychical Research, which I always find so fascinating. This group of heavy friends sitting around talking about paranormal phenomena. And even in his writing, I always go back to the Easter greeting, where he talks about that state in between sleeping and waking, and that's kind of how the essay starts. So even something that he's writing for small children, he brings that up. And of course, when you're reading Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, I think it's a fun moment for anyone of any age when Alice thinks something and then the caterpillar answers her out loud, and you think, oh, wait a minute, he just read her mind. Wait, what just happened? That was ESP. So definitely these ideas creep into his work for sure. And you mentioned in his that he used some interesting things to treat his migraines. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think he must have been aware of the fly agaric use in Siberia accounts, because that sort of that real telltale motif of a straw looking like a huge oak log inspires the distortions of size and shape in Alice in Wonderland. But it's also, the mushrooms are only one of the things in Alice in Wonderland that do that. Cakes and other things do that. And in the same way, I think the fly agaric was only one of the sources of inspiration for Carroll here. he would have been, I mean, he used homeopathic remedies, and these included some, I mean, the plant intoxicants that were really well known were opium, and then also that whole family of nightshades, things like, belladonna and datura and wolfsbane and henbane and so on. And they were, I think, belladonna and aconite were commonly used in homeopathic remedies. So he'd probably have taken them, but they would have been obviously at homeopathic doses, sort of very, very psychoactive, if indeed present at all. And I think, in his direct experience, it seems to be, I mean, as you say, he was very interested in all these different states between sleep and waking. Epileptic seizures he was very interested in. He witnessed on occasions and wrote about them. He sought out, I think he went to Bart's Hospital in London to watch anesthesia under chloroform to see how that worked. And, he had lifelong insomnia, I guess, so he spent a lot of time in those states between sleep and waking. And as you mentioned, migraines, and he talks a little bit about seeing what are now called auras, these sort of castellations and battlements and those kind of repeating shapes. And those are, I mean, neurologists in the 1950s became quite obsessed with Alice in Wonderland, and they said there is a Alice in Wonderland syndrome that people talk about, which is seeing things that are small looking big, and particularly sort of body image being distorted, people being convinced that, for example, that their necks are very elongated, there's a sort of call back to Alice in Wonderland, or they're becoming too large or too small for the room that they're in. So these kind of things are all associated with Carroll. And also the other literary reference here is Jonathan Swift and Gulliver's Travels. People talk about Lilliputian hallucinations, and people who have sort of migraine auras similar to Carroll's often talk about seeing, little troops of little people, diminutive people, kind of little lines of them, marching around. And this is very well documented. It actually happens. It's a side effect of some Parkinson's disease medications. So it's probably to do with dopamine dysregulation. Yeah, that world of the world of Alice in Wonderland was sort of, obviously, was sunk deep into the childhood reading of the post-war generation of neurologists and psychiatrists, and so all these ideas from Alice in Wonderland have now been kind of pathologized and introduced into the medical literature.
I don't want to get too off topic here, but since we're still talking about medical uses for these type of things, in your essay, you said that Lewis wrote skeptically in his letters about the pervasive presence in syrups and soothing tonics of powerful narcotics like opium, the medicines so dexterously but ineffectually concealed in the jam of our early childhood. Were they really spoon-feeding opium to children in Victorian times?
Oh, they certainly were. Victorian patent medicines included opium and morphine, and sometimes cannabis, and often chloroform. That was, by the end of the 19th century, there was quite a consumer movement against this, or a consumer movement calling for better regulation and for better lists of ingredients, because there were patent medicines which were sort of distinct from kind of the sort of clean, sort of chemicals. You didn't have to say what was in them, and there were all kinds of things for everything from sort of backache to menstrual cramps to headaches to and they all just were very sweetened because that hid the sort of bitterness of the ingredients, and lots of patent manufacturers realized that basically the more, you know, opium or even cocaine or cannabis you put in the medicine, the better people would feel after taking it. And so they were kind of very overloaded with it. And so Carroll was you know, part of quite a sort of large movement of consumers complaining about this and wanting more transparency. And by the end of the 19th century, turning into the 20th, people were starting to voluntarily remove the you know, opium and morphine and cocaine from these remedies, and you know, put more informative packaging and labels on them, and that kind of began as a consumer movement before it became statutory regulation.
That's a valid complaint. I think you might want to know what's going on in the medicine you're taking, concealed in the jam of your early childhood.
That's right. Yes, and there are particularly branded ones, you know, famously sort of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which had a picture of this sort of dumpy governess kind of giving spoonfuls of this to young children. And Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was mostly opium and morphine.
Wow, that's fascinating to me. Amazing. I wanted to make sure I covered some audience questions. I made a call out to our members and asked them to send some questions in. Going back to migraines, one person was wondering, do you think just migraines in general is one of the things that inspired the changes in perception in the growing larger and smaller in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland?
I think it, whether specifically that, but I mean, I think that's, to go back to my sort of slightly kind of leading questions at the beginning, I think, you know, the answer is no. I think it's extraordinarily unlikely that Carroll actually, you know, with his, you know, quite delicate health, you know, and his disapproval of tobacco, you know, as well as opium, extraordinarily unlikely that he ventured on some kind of crazy experiment with magic mushrooms. But I think he would have had the experience of, you know, his sensorium and his perceptions being strangely altered by migraine and by seeing things that aren't there, and by spending a lot of time in that sort of zone between sleep and waking. So I think, you know, I think that all that kind of, you know, contributed to the idea that, you know, of the kind of adventures that Alice undergoes underground.
We had another audience question, which actually like gave me a whole new epiphany. Like she mentioned she was just basically skeptical. I mean, like you are, that like, oh, he couldn't have been thinking of the fly agaric for the mushroom, because he wouldn't be telling a little kid to go eat a poisonous mushroom. But then I thought, well, wait a minute, like, why would he tell a kid to eat any mushroom? If we're talking about earlier, she said like, oh, I won't drink this because it's poison, or I have to make sure it's not marked poison. And yet we're just willy-nilly telling kids to just go and eat part of a mushroom when they were known to be so dangerous. So that's a funny contradiction that had actually never occurred to me before.
Of course, the mushroom that the caterpillar is sitting on is not a fly agaric. You know, that's incredibly distinctive, and I think I think he'd probably felt it to be inappropriate to have Alice eating a fly agaric mushroom, because fly agaric mushrooms do grow in British woods. You do find them; they're very spectacular. And the first thing that any parent will tell a child is, "Don't eat that. It's poisonous." But so I think, yeah, the idea of, you know, even sort of eating a generic mushroom is, yeah, I mean, is, you know, and Alice is a sensible child. She's obviously aware that these things can be poisonous. So I guess it's just trust the caterpillar.
Right? Advice from a caterpillar. She took it for sure. It is important to note, as you mentioned, it's very much a generic mushroom that the caterpillar is sitting on, right? Both in Alice's Adventures Underground for Carroll's own drawings and Tenniel's drawings. It's, I mean, does it resemble any sort of specific mushroom that you can think, or is it just mushroom?
It looks sort of like a Rossula, which is a genus of which there are lots of mushrooms, which has that big flat cap and often spongy gills underneath. If you could see the underside, you'd be able to say more. But I think there's quite a lot of Victorian fiction about mushrooms, which tends to go for non-specific, types of mushroom, even when it, I mean, I'm thinking of, there's a short story by H.G. Wells called The Purple Pileus, and the purple pileus is a mushroom that a character in the story eats in the woods, and it turns out to have these very strange psychic and hallucinogenic effects. And Wells says, you know, he was about the character, he was looking around the woods and he saw some of those red and white spotted ones and some of those other yellow ones, and then he saw this lovely purple one. So, you know, I think writers tended to deliberately fudge the question of mushroom taxonomy, because it wasn't really understood, you know, which mushroom was the toxic one or the hallucinogenic one.
That makes sense. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned the Seven Sisters of Sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the one that he actually visited the library where that book was being held? So like, we think he might have seen it there?
Yeah, there was actually an American scholar here who lived in Oxford called Michael Carmichael, who wrote a great piece, and he said he'd been to the Bodleian Library. He said that as far as he could tell, Carroll only went there once, and he dug out their copy of Seven Sisters of Sleep, and it was still mostly uncut, but it was cut at the title page. And then the only chapter that was cut was the philosophers chapter, which is called The Exile of Siberia. So knowing Carroll's interest in Russia, it might be plausible that Seven Sisters of Sleep would have attracted him as a title because of his sisters and his own sort of, you know, problems with sleep. And that if he'd cut open the title page, he'd have seen a chapter about Siberia and might have looked at that. So that's possible, but unverifiable. But I think he would probably have known that story anyway before then, because Mordecai Cook would have got it from other sources that Carroll would probably have been familiar with already.
And of course, Carroll famously visited Russia. I feel like we always say, oh, it's the only foreign country he ever visited, but of course he had to travel through several others to get there, right? It wasn't, he didn't take a bullet train there.
He didn't get Aeroplot. No.
Yes, exactly. What do you think of the song White Rabbit?
Well, I think the interesting thing about the psychedelic 60s and that rediscovery of Alice in Wonderland there is that we tend to forget that at that time, of White Rabbit 1967, I guess, what we now call magic mushrooms, the psilocybin containing mushrooms, you know, the ones that people grow from spore kits, or the little ones that we have here, it was not known that they were psychoactive in the 1960s. Well, actually, it was known. There is a paper by a French mycologist from 1962 in which he established that, you know, the Liberty Cap contains psilocybin, but for some reason the 60s came and went without the hippies ever kind of clocking this. So they kind of know, you know, it's still in this sort of zone where they kind of know that there are mushrooms there that are hallucinogenic, but they don't quite know what they are. So they always reference the flyagric mushroom, you know, and Alice in Wonderland. And actually, you know, it's only like the early mid-70s that people in the psychedelic counterculture start to discover, you know, what we now think of as the magic mushroom. So I think, you know, that's always curious when you look back at 1960s culture and you think, what's, you know, they're all obsessed with Victorian kind of psychedelia and Alice in Wonderland and flyagrics. And you think, you know, then you realize actually that's because they didn't know, you know, they hadn't yet discovered that they actually had, you know, properly psychedelic mushrooms growing under their feet.
That is so fascinating. I did not realize that. Think of all the concert posters and
Yeah.
t-shirts that all these mushrooms are on, and they really had no idea. All right, I want to make sure we got to all our audience questions.
Do you want to talk about Emperor Claudius? I don't have a huge amount to say, but I can.
Oh yeah, that was a very specific question.
It was.
I actually, yeah, so he was poisoned by mushrooms, perhaps? Is that the case?
Perhaps various classical sources say that Claudius was given a poison mushroom and murdered. yeah, Juvenal, I think, as well as Tacitus and quite a few. It's a little bit unclear. What would that mushroom have been? I mean, if you really wanted to kill somebody with a mushroom, then, you know, by far and away the easiest would be the death cap, the destroying angel. But that doesn't kill people as quickly as Claudius died. Claudius died kind of like, you know, after dinner in the small hours of the morning, a few hours later. And the death cap, as we know from sort of recent kind of lurid murder mysteries, you know, kind of makes you sick, and then you feel like you've gotten better, and then for 2 or 3 days you feel fine while it's kind of dissolving all your internal organs, and you die about a week later. So who knows? I think medical sources who've looked at it are not convinced that Claudius was poisoned. You know, he might well have just had a, you know, huge kind of sort of coronary thrombosis or something, which was quite common. There were also other classical sources that say, no, it wasn't a poison mushroom, it was a poison feather and so on. So I think, you know, this is still kind of in the realm of myth. But what it does tell us is that mushrooms were a delicacy, you know, in Roman cuisine, which is interesting. There's quite a north-south split in Europe. Still to this day, you find in the south of France and in Spain and Italy, people will go out picking mushrooms very enthusiastically in the autumn and will kind of eat everything. And there are sort of fatalities, you know, very regularly. And pharmacists have posters in the windows saying, don't eat this one and don't eat that one. Whereas once you're up in Northern Europe, in kind of Germany and Scandinavia and Britain, everybody just assumes that all mushrooms are poisonous and you wouldn't eat any of them.
I'm sorry, what was the other name for the death cap? You called it
Destroying angel.
It's so dangerous, it needs 2
I know.
nicknames. Oh my heavens. Death cap and destroying angel.
Yeah.
Stay away from those.
Mm.
So I feel like we covered all our audience questions. Was there anything else that you wanted to add on the topic in general, whether it's about Lewis Carroll or mushrooms in Victorian times?
No, that's great. I think we've done not only Victorian times, we've reached back to classical times and
We went
forward
back.
to the 20th century. Yeah.
We did some time traveling there for sure. Well, I
Yeah.
want to urge everyone to go to mikej.net if you want to learn more about Mike's other work. In fact, do you have any books coming out anytime soon?
My last book was called Psychonauts, Drugs and the Making of the Modern Mind. And most of that is about Victorian attitudes to drugs, and particularly Victorian scientists and doctors self-experimenting with drugs, and how you know, how that forged our understanding of their action.
Excellent. So if anyone's more interested in this topic, because I'm sure a lot of people will be, run out and buy Psychonauts and read all about it. I want to thank you so much for talking to the Lewis Carroll Society of North America today. I know everyone is going to enjoy hearing about this so much from such a respected source on the topic. And thank you so much.
Oh, real pleasure, Heather. Thank you.
All right. Okay, and now I'm here live and in person. I want to thank Mike J so much for spending so much time with me. I also want to thank the people who submitted audience questions ahead of time. I sent out that article, Fungi, Folklore in Fairyland. I always get the name wrong. And Ruth Berman, August Imholtz, and Dana Noon all sent me some really great questions that I tried to just incorporate into the whole talk. There were a few times where I just said, you know, here's an audience question, because I didn't know how else to work it in. But yeah, thank you to you three, because that was immensely helpful for me.